They say history is written by the victors, but what if the truth was buried with the fallen? Every secret leaves a trace, if you know where to look. This is The Broken Truth, decoding history, one broadcast at a time. The Broken Truth podcast, where history meets conspiracy. Every case tells a story, every story hides a lie. The year is 1962. A cold March rain slicks the streets of Washington, D.C. Inside the Pentagon, in a windowless conference room on the E-ring, a group of men in pressed uniforms lean over a long mahogany table. Cigarette smoke coils toward the ceiling. The air tastes of coffee and ambition. A red folder sits at the center, stamped in bold black ink. Top secret. It carries a single title: Justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. These aren't spies or fringe operatives. They're the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military figures in the United States. They believe they're defending freedom. What they're about to propose would betray it. One by one, they initial the pages. Plans are discussed in measured tones. A hijacked airliner, explosions in Miami. Funerals staged for the press. Each line item ends with the same phrase: blame Cuba. Most Americans never heard these words until 35 years later, when the document finally emerged from a vault. But on that day in 1962, it was real. It had signatures. And if it had been approved, the history of the Western Hemisphere might read very differently. Tonight, we reopen that file. This is Operation Northwoods, the plan to stage false flag attacks on American soil. I'm Garrett Greene, and this is the Broken Truth podcast. The early 1960s were years of contradiction. On the surface, optimism, progress, the dawn of the space age. Underneath, panic, paranoia, the constant drum of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had tested the hydrogen bomb. Castro's revolution had planted a red flag just 90 miles from Florida. And in Washington, a young president named John F. Kennedy was being told that America's greatest enemy might soon aim nuclear weapons straight at Miami. Out of that tension came a desperate idea. If Cuba won't give us a reason to invade, we'll create one. That idea became a memo. That memo became a plan. And that plan became one of the darkest chapters ever drafted in a democracy. Operation Northwoods wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a conspiracy theory whispered on late-night radio. It was a real document, signed, stamped, and filed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Tonight we'll walk through the fear that birthed it, the men who built it, the president who stopped it, and the echoes that still ripple through modern warfare and media manipulation. Because sometimes the scariest secrets are the ones that were written down in plain English. Let's start where the fear began. To understand how Operation Northwoods came to exist, you have to feel the air of that era. The dread, the pride, the calculation. America in the late 1950s had just survived a decade of atomic drills and ideological crusades. Children hid under desks while the government built fallout shelters. Senators built careers accusing neighbors of communist ties. The Cold War wasn't a war of bullets. It was a war of nerves. When Fidel Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista, Washington first watched with cautious hope. Maybe this young revolutionary would keep Cuba independent of Moscow. Within a year, that illusion shattered. Castro nationalized American-owned sugar and oil industries. He welcomed Soviet advisors. U.S. intelligence cables described Havana as a tropical outpost of Kremlin strategy. For President Eisenhower, then Kennedy, Cuba wasn't just a small island. It was a domino balanced on the edge of the Caribbean, one push away from toppling confidence in U.S. dominance throughout Latin America. The CIA responded first. Under Allen Dulles, plans took shape for a covert invasion using Cuban exiles. It would be swift, deniable, and surgical, or so they thought. April 1961, the Bay of Pigs, a disaster. The invaders were pinned down on beaches. The Cuban Air Force decimated their boats. American fingerprints were obvious. Castro emerged stronger. Inside the Pentagon, humiliation curdled into fury. Generals whispered that the civilians didn't have the stomach for real war. Behind closed doors, they began sketching alternatives. By the fall of 1961, the CIA's Operation Mongoose was launched. Hundreds of sabotage missions, biological plots, propaganda leaflets. Yet nothing dislodged Castro. That failure fed an obsession, create a trigger, a spark that would turn public opinion and Congress toward open invasion. That spark is what the Joint Chiefs believed they found when they conceived Operation Northwoods. At the top sat General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Disciplined, old school, convinced that communism could only be crushed by decisive force. Around him, General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, famed for the firebombing of Japan, blunt, fearless, often reckless. Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr., Navy Chief, strategist with a hawkish streak. General Earl Wheeler of the Army, General David Shoup of the Marines. Together they represented the iron will of the U.S. military establishment. To them, the Cold War wasn't a metaphor, it was a front line. The CIA had its own frustrations. Robert Kennedy oversaw covert ops and demanded results. So when the Pentagon floated the idea of a provocation to justify direct action, few in Langley blinked. The only obstacle left was moral clarity, and the man who embodied it sat in the Oval Office. The Joint Chiefs saw themselves as guardians of national survival. From their perspective, public opinion was a variable, malleable, manageable, sometimes expendable. A line from a 1961 internal memo captured it perfectly. The American people are willing to pay any price when the threat is made visible. Visibility. That was the missing ingredient. If Cuba could be framed as an aggressor, the moral calculus flipped overnight. Remember, this was the same period when the CIA tested mind-altering drugs under MK Ultra, and when psychological operations were being woven into military doctrine. Perception management wasn't a conspiracy, it was policy. So the question became, how far are we willing to go to make the threat visible? Fear was a currency, and the Pentagon was running the mint. Every intelligence brief warned of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Recon flights photographed crates that could be launchers. Newspapers speculated daily about a second Pearl Harbor. For the generals, fear wasn't a problem. It was an opportunity. It justified budgets, secrecy, and urgency. One colonel later recalled, if you could make the public see smoke on the horizon, they'd hand you matches. Operation Northwoods was designed to light that match. In our next act, we'll open the red-stamped memo itself and read, line by line, how America nearly declared war on a lie, March 13th, 1962, in a windowless office of the Joint Chiefs Planning Room. Typists in uniform feed classified sheets into carbon copy machines. The header reads, Top Secret, Special Handling. This is the birth certificate of Operation Northwoods. The document opens with language that feels clinical, bureaucratic, until you read between the lines. The proposed operations should be developed so as to appear to be the result of Cuban provocation. In one sentence, America's highest military body just authorized the manufacture of reality. General Lyman Lemnitzer had approved it. He'd served through World War II and Korea, watched politicians hesitate while soldiers died. To him, Northwoods wasn't treason. It was strategy. Colonel Edward Lansdale, a master of psychological warfare under Operation Mongoose, fed concepts into the draft. His credo was simple. Perception is 9/10 of victory. In meeting minutes, Lansdale suggested a series of pretext incidents that would create the proper international image of a Cuban threat. To the Joint Chiefs, this was not lunacy. It was mathematics. One fabricated attack equals national unity plus congressional approval plus green light for invasion. The first proposal, sinking a U.S. ship in the vicinity of Guantanamo Bay. The memo reads, we could blow up a U.S. ship and blame Cuba. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. It even references a modern precedent, the Maine explosion of 1898. the event that sparked the Spanish-American War. The authors understood how powerful a martyrship could be in rallying a nation. They didn't need truth, they needed headlines. Then comes the most infamous line of all. An aircraft at Eglin AFB would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered airplane belonging to a CIA front organization. The substitute aircraft would be loaded with selected passengers, and a drone would be destroyed over Cuban territory. Translation: 2 planes, one with people, one empty. Swap them mid-flight, destroy the drone. Blame Cuba. It reads like fiction, but it was typed on Pentagon letterhead. Engineers were already experimenting with radio-controlled aircraft for target practice. Lemnitzer's memo simply suggested repurposing that technology for propaganda. Next, a paragraph that still shocks historians. We could develop a Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The plan included bombing empty buildings, planting fake evidence, and arresting pre-selected Cuban agents. To make the narrative stick, they suggested faking casualty lists and holding public funerals to maximize the desired emotional impact. In essence, an entire national psychodrama, scripted in advance. Every page assumed media cooperation. In 1962, the press was largely patriotic and deferential to the Pentagon. A sentence notes, "The timing of press releases and leaks will be coordinated to achieve maximum national impact." This was Operation Mockingbird's spirit in uniform. State narrative as news bulletin. Reading it today is like watching truth reverse engineered. Finally, the closing argument to Secretary of Defense McNamara. Any one of the incidents listed above could be expected to develop a credible public attitude of hostility toward Cuba and a justification for U.S. military intervention. No hesitation, no ethics footnote, just a confidence that public emotion can be engineered like a weapon system. Lemnitzer signed it on March 13th. The file was forwarded to the Secretary of Defense under the code Northwoods. Within days, the document landed on Robert McNamara's desk. He read it, stared at the signatures, and was stunned. According to later accounts, McNamara quietly hand-delivered it to President Kennedy. Their meeting was brief, tense. Kennedy's only comment, "We're not going to start a war with Cuba." But behind his measured tone was anger. He realized that some of his own military leaders were willing to sacrifice civilians for political gain. Within months, Lemnitzer's term as chairman was not renewed. He was moved to NATO. The memo was buried. For decades, few outside the Pentagon knew it existed, but concepts don't die so easily. They mutate. And false flags had a long history before Northwoods, and a longer shadow after. To understand why Northwoods was plausible, we have to understand the precedent. Governments have long known that nothing unites a population faster than a sense of victimhood. 1939, the Gleiwitz incident. Nazi operatives dressed as Polish soldiers attack a German radio tower. Berlin uses it to justify invading Poland. 1898, USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. The press cries, "Remember the Maine." The U.S. goes to war with Spain. 1788, Swedish King Gustav III orders his own troops to wear Russian uniforms and fire on a border post, triggering the Russo-Swedish War. Deception as prelude to war is an ancient art. Northwoods was merely an American edition of a global pattern. By the 1960s, psychological operations were codified into doctrine. Field Manual 33-5 outlined how emotional provocation could alter enemy and civilian behavior. False flag operations fit that template. They convert emotion into policy momentum. Imagine the sequence the chiefs envisioned. A blast in Miami, breaking news, public rage, congressional resolution, tanks on the beach at Havana. Each link in that chain was carefully plotted. Only one thing could break it: truth. Reports are coming in that Cuban forces have attacked a U.S. ship near Guantanamo. That's how it would have sounded. And in 1962, few Americans would have questioned it. Television was new. Trust in authority was high. The press was fed by official briefings. And official briefings were gospel. Operation Northwoods anticipated that information flow. They knew how narratives calcify before facts emerge. The memo was a masterclass in media timing, decades before the term information warfare existed. When people are frightened, they don't look for proof, they look for protection. That's the cornerstone of false flag design. Behavioral scientists later called it the rally effect. Approval ratings surge after a national trauma. The Northwoods planners counted on that instinct. It's not that they hated democracy. They believed they were saving it by bypassing its delays, but bypassing democracy is how democracies die. Scholars who analyze the Northwoods memo see its DNA in later campaigns. Operation Chaos, 1967. Domestic surveillance of anti-war activists. COINTELPRO. FBI fabrication of letters and plots to discredit movements. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. Misreported naval attack that opened the door to Vietnam. None of these are identical to Northwoods, but they share its logic. Control the narrative first, justify the action later. What makes Northwoods so haunting is how reasonable it sounded to those who wrote it. There was no cartoon villainy, just cold strategy. The memo's authors weren't madmen. They were professionals under pressure, shaped by a system that rewarded results over reflection. That's why Kennedy's rejection mattered. He drew a line that later leaders might have blurred. In a way, Operation Northwoods isn't just a story about what the government almost did. It's a mirror reflecting what any nation is capable of when fear outruns conscience. In March 1962, Robert McNamara walks a red-stamped folder down a short hallway toward the Oval Office. The president looks up from a naval report. The folder lands softly on his desk. "What's this?" he asks. "A proposal from the Joint Chiefs," McNamara answers. Kennedy opens it. The silence that follows is heavy enough to measure in heartbeats. The document in his hands outlines staged attacks, fake funerals, the deliberate killing of innocents. Kennedy reads every line, closes the folder, and finally says, "We're not going to do this." Those 6 words marked the moment civilian oversight reasserted itself over military ambition. Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled podcast, but this episode is brought to you by the Broken Truth merch. Support the show. Wear the truth. Official Broken Truth podcast merch is live now. Links in the description. And since you've made it this far in the episode, comment #BrokenTruth and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite platform. Because when you speak up, the algorithm listens. And so does the world. Declassified oral histories confirm that the president's reaction was restrained but icy. He told McNamara to file the memo away and not circulate it further. Then he called in his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, and ordered a full review of covert operations against Cuba. Within weeks, Lemnitzer's reappointment as chairman of the Joint Chiefs quietly vanished from discussion. For Lemnitzer, it was a professional humiliation. For Kennedy, it was a moral necessity. The president had inherited the Bay of Pigs fiasco and watched the Pentagon blame civilians for its own misjudgment. He was done taking advice that treated ethics as optional, but the decision didn't end the tension. It deepened it. Behind closed doors, some generals whispered that the president was naive, soft on communism, perhaps even reckless. "He doesn't understand the stakes," LeMay allegedly said to aides. "He's going to get us all killed." To the military, caution looked like weakness. To Kennedy, their zeal looked like madness. The following months only widened that rift. When U-2 reconnaissance flights later revealed Soviet missiles in Cuba, the same Joint Chiefs who drafted Northwoods urged an immediate bombing campaign. The very escalation Kennedy feared. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 forced Kennedy to rely on diplomacy while generals pressed for war. In those 13 days, the same mindset that birthed Northwoods resurfaced. The belief that a dramatic strike could solve everything. Kennedy resisted, choosing a naval blockade instead. The world came within a breath of annihilation, and stepped back. When the crisis ended peacefully, Kennedy's mistrust of military adventurism was cemented. The generals' mistrust of Kennedy hardened into quiet resentment. By 1963, Lemnitzer had been reassigned as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe, a prestigious exile. In interviews years later, he spoke little of Northwoods, dismissing it as staff brainstorming, but documents show he initialed every page. The plan had reached the President of the United States and been killed only by moral instinct. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Lemnitzer's file on Northwoods disappeared into classified archives, proof that suppression can look a lot like self-preservation. Northwoods reveals more about Kennedy than it does about his generals. He was a Cold War warrior who believed in strength, yet he recognized that deception corrodes democracy from within. In rejecting the plan, he reaffirmed a principle, that the ends do not justify the means, not when the means involve lying to the very people you serve. It's ironic that this act of restraint, not aggression, may have sealed his fate with certain factions of the national security establishment. For a brief moment, morality overrode momentum. And then, silence. The plan was shelved, filed, forgotten, until curiosity resurrected it decades later. Flash forward 35 years. The year is 1997. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The United States is busy digitizing its archives. Inside a warehouse at College Park, Maryland, researchers from the National Security Archive are combing through boxes labeled Department of Defense, 1960s. One box holds a file folder marked Northwoods. They read. They stop. They read again. On those yellowing pages lay the unthinkable. A government-authored plan to stage terror attacks on its own citizens. James Bamford, an intelligence journalist later known for his book, Body of Secrets, was among the first to publicize the discovery. In 2001, he wrote, "The Joint Chiefs of Staff drew up and approved plans to blow up U.S. ships, stage bombings, and even fake airliner disasters. It was perhaps the most corrupt plan ever created by the American government." When that quote hit the press, the story went viral, long before social media existed. The Pentagon did not deny the document. It simply pointed out that it had never been implemented. In official language, that was true. In moral language, it wasn't enough. Americans who read the memo felt a line of trust snap. If this was once conceivable, what else might have been? Major newspapers covered it cautiously. The Washington Post ran a brief. ABC News aired a 2-minute segment. Then the story faded beneath headlines about the Clinton scandal. But online, in the young world of forums and message boards, Operation Northwoods became a seed that grew into a forest of skepticism. For millions, it was proof that conspiracy theories weren't always fiction. Sometimes they were classified policy waiting to be found. Historians and ethicists parsed the memo line by line. Dr. John Prados of the National Security Archive noted, "It shows the extent to which Cold War thinking corroded ethical judgment." Others argued it demonstrated the system working, because civilian leadership had rejected the proposal. But the larger lesson was clear: bureaucracies can generate monsters without ever meaning to. Over time, Operation Northwoods became a footnote in textbooks and a touchstone in documentaries. It surfaced in debates about Vietnam, Iran-Contra, and the War on Terror. Each generation rediscovered it as if for the first time. A haunting reminder that secrecy is a loop, not a line. The significance of Operation Northwoods is not in what happened, but in what almost did. It draws a bright line between security and subversion, between protecting a nation and performing it. It forces every citizen to ask, if those in power can justify a lie for our own good, how do we ever measure truth again? Because truth isn't only what happened, it's what we refuse to invent. Today, false flags no longer require ships or planes. They require data. A forged video, a deep fake, a fabricated tweet can ignite a cyber conflict before dawn. The logic of Northwoods, control perception to control policy, has evolved into the logic of algorithms. That's why this story still matters. Because the battle for truth didn't end in 1962. It just changed platforms. When we return for the final chapter, we'll examine the legacy of Operation Northwoods, how it reshaped our definition of trust, and why democracy's greatest defense may always be public memory. History doesn't end when a plan is shelved. It lingers. The fingerprints of Northwoods show up in places no one expects, sometimes as influence, sometimes as warning. 2 years after Northwoods was buried, another incident pulled America into another war. Reports claim North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress responded with overwhelming authorization for war in Vietnam. Decades later, declassified files showed the second attack never happened. Radar ghosts, misread sonar, adrenaline, and policy built on illusion. It wasn't Northwoods reborn, it was Northwoods remembered. During the 1970s, revelations about COINTELPRO and Operation Chaos exposed how federal agencies had infiltrated protest movements, written fake letters, staged smear campaigns. The stated goal: protect national security. The effect: erode public faith. Congress's Church Committee. Hearings uncovered memos echoing Northwood's logic, the need to shape public perception in times of internal crisis. Jump forward again. The digital age. Wars now begin not with bullets, but with images. A single photograph can launch outrage. A single clip can justify a strike. In that sense, the spirit of Northwoods, manufacture the narrative first, remains alive wherever unverified spectacle outruns verification. The term false flag migrated from the classified world to everyday vocabulary. It became shorthand for distrust, from talk radio hosts to internet forums. Some cry it at every tragedy, others dismiss it entirely, but the truth is subtler. Northwoods proved the concept could exist. The myth that followed proved the damage it left behind. When people design deception long enough, they start to believe in its necessity. Psychologists studying the Cold War found a pattern called mission creep of morality. Each small compromise seems rational until you look back and see the abyss you've crossed. Northwoods was that abyss on paper, a warning written in bureaucratic ink. If there's a silver lining, it's this: the system stopped it. Civilian control held. Kennedy said no. That line between military ambition and democratic oversight is the firewall that keeps republics from turning on themselves. But like any firewall, it only works if citizens know it exists and demand it stay intact. Because when fear and secrecy meet, truth becomes collateral damage. Operation Northwoods forces us to confront a difficult question. What are we willing to believe in the name of safety? Every generation faces a mirror moment. For the founders, it was the decision to break from empire. For the Cold War era, it was whether survival justified subterfuge. For us, it's whether information itself can be trusted. Northwoods shows how easily ethics can be edited out of policy when fear edits the script. Democracies forget by convenience. Files gather dust. Outrage fades. But the only antidote to deception is memory. When history is remembered accurately, not sensationalized, not sanitized, it becomes armor. Behind every classified stamp are people. Secretaries who typed the memos, soldiers who followed orders, presidents who chose silence or courage. Operation Northwoods reminds us that institutions act through individuals, and individuals can still say no. That single word changed history once. It can again. Today's false flags may not use explosives. They use algorithms. They exploit bias, outrage, and division. Understanding Northwoods equips us to spot the pattern. Sudden fear, immediate blame, calls for sweeping action. The first question every citizen should ask is simple: who benefits from what I'm being told? Truth isn't comfortable, it's heavy. It demands skepticism without cynicism, faith without blindness. The broken truth isn't the absence of facts. It's the refusal to accept easy ones. Operation Northwoods is more than a declassified relic. It's a cautionary tale about how power rationalizes itself when fear writes the headlines. And it's proof that transparency, even decades late, can still reclaim trust. If you take anything from tonight's episode, let it be this: freedom doesn't vanish in one dramatic coup. It erodes through quiet proposals filed in neat folders marked top secret. Those proposals will always exist. The question is whether someone, somewhere, has the courage to read them. and say no. I'm Garrett Greene. This has been the Broken Truth Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the truth isn't whole, it's broken.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known, but you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is the broken truth, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.